Good evening. It's June 27th, 2014. You're joining us for our regular webcast with the LaRouchePack.com. It's Friday night. My name is Matthew Ogden. Mr. LaRouche will not be joining us in the studio tonight as he is still recuperating, but I am joined by Dennis Small from Executive Intelligence Review and by Cody Jones from the LaRouche Pack scientific team. And the three of us had a discussion this morning with Mr. Lyndon Larouche in preparation for this broadcast, and the answers to the questions that you hear tonight do reflect directly Mr. LaRouche's thinking. Now, we will begin tonight with our institutional question, as usual, and again, this was presented to Mr. LaRouche, and I'll ask Dennis to deliver Mr. LaRouche's response. It reads as follows. Mr. LaRouche, what type of regional and international cooperation do you envision to resolve the Syrian and Iraqi conflict? Thank you.
Thank you, Matt, and good evening to everyone. Mr. LaRouche's response to this question of what kind of measures are needed was very straightforward. Get rid of President Obama. That's the one thing that's needed, he said, because without that, there is no possibility of resolution of these crises and of the danger of thermonuclear war, which looms immediately behind the situation in Iraq, the situation in Ukraine, the situation in Syria. Mr. LaRouche said that Obama is a totally hopeless creature, that he responds to no lawful process whatsoever. He has violated the Constitution in innumerable ways, and that either we mobilize and achieve his expulsion from office by constitutional means, or there is no solution to the indicated crises. Now, in that regard, Mr. LaRouche wanted to draw your attention to what has already been in much of the media over the course of this week with the passing of Howard Baker of Watergate fame. Because what can be heard on the radio and on TV clips of that time is the question that Howard Baker was publicly and insistently asking of President Nixon at the time. What did he know, and when did he know it? What did he know, and when did he know it? And Mr. LaRouche said that absolutely applies to the current situation with President Obama, and furthermore, the additional question that Mr. LaRouche would like to ask is, when did Obama know that he was a liar? Because he has lied through his teeth throughout his entire presidency. We know that, said Mr. LaRouche. Ignorant people may not be aware of that yet, but we know that, and Mr. LaRouche actually said so 5 years ago in a nationwide TV broadcast where he identified Obama's narcissism, his absolutely incorrigible lying, and the fact that he was operating as a political asset of the British Empire and of the Queen of England in particular, and of her policies, which center around the issue of depopulation of the planet from about 7 billion people down to 1 billion people, or less. The radicals propose that it be less than 1 billion. Now, LaRouche added that not only is this a fact about Obama's lying and his criminal activity and his representation of the British Empire, but that furthermore, those who protect him are complicit in these activities and in these crimes, and that has to stop. Now, in this regard, LaRouche Pack this week, as many of you may be aware, has been circulating since Tuesday night, Wednesday morning, a nationwide leaflet based on a statement issued by Mr. LaRouche, which is called LaRouche, Hillary Clinton's Benghazi revelations mean Obama must be impeached immediately. Now, in this statement, Mr. LaRouche refers to the revelations in a recently published book by Edward Klein entitled Blood Feud, in which, among other things, he recounts from first-hand sources at the occasion that President Obama pressured Hillary Clinton to lie, knowingly lie, because Obama knew perfectly well, as did the whole administration, that the attack going on September 11, 2012, in Benghazi, Libya, was in fact an al-Qaeda linked operation linked to this organization called Ansar al-Sharia, and that it had nothing to do with videos that people were watching there, good, bad, or indifferent. It had to do with the simple fact that this was the 11th of September, and this was a politically motivated terrorist attack. This was totally known. It was completely obvious. And yet Obama called Hillary Clinton and demanded that she lie about this publicly. Now, what the LaRouche statement says in this leaflet is that this makes Obama and his documented lies, it makes him an accomplice after the fact in those murders of the 4 American citizens, including the ambassador, who were the victims of that terrorist operation. Mr. LaRouche again insists in this leaflet that Congress must act and that the time for partisan opportunism and cowardice is over. Now, I have to say that the issuance of this leaflet and its mass distribution, which has been going on this week in Washington, D.C., is something where, yet again, the American media, one could say, have been Sputniked. Because what happened is that Russia's Voice of Russia, which is a government-owned international radio agency in Russia, within 24 hours of the circulation of this document and the statements of John Boehner, where he talked about not impeaching Obama, but maybe he would launch some some legal action against him, Voice of Russia went right to the source of what's really going on. And they interviewed Mr. LaRouche because they wanted to know what was really happening. And what LaRouche said on that interview with Voice of Russia was, quote, Obama is in violation of the U.S. Constitution. Various institutions have very strong reasons and arguments for saying that Obama should be called to account. He is actually on the edge of being thrown out of office. If we don't get Obama out, we're headed for thermonuclear war. Now, in further discussion earlier today, as Matt was indicating, Mr. LaRouche elaborated on this. He said, look, there can be no peace on a global basis as long as Obama remains in the presidency. He has not only challenged the very existence of the United States Constitution, but the underlying problem is that he is a representative of the British Empire and the British Empire's policies. And those policies, under the current conditions of a global financial implosion underway, under the conditions of a desperation from the British Empire and its allies, such as in Saudi Arabia and the Obama presidency, to ram through a bail-in policy for the restructuring of that system, which means depopulating the planet by about 6 out of 7 billion people, that policy which Obama is implementing must be stopped immediately, or there is no hope for the world, either on the war front or on the economic front. And those are the issues that have to be addressed, Mr. LaRouche said. The issues are the very destruction of the nation state, the destruction of individual creativity, and the imposition of a bestial concept of man that suits the British Empire's views and policy objectives. Now, I should add for people's information, excuse me, that in addition to the very useful Klein revelations in that book, which certainly raises the right issue for the American public to consider, there's actually been going on over the course of this week and over the weekend prior a kind of political pile-on against Obama, led by LaRouche and LaRouche PAC, but this is really taking on proportions that we have not seen in a long time, and in fact makes the fruit ripe for the picking. For example, the Supreme Court of the United States voted 9-0 in a decision where they declared that what President Obama had done on the issue of recess appointments was a violation of the Constitution. Obama was not only taking advantage of established recesses to make appointments, which perhaps other presidents have done, he announced that he was the one who decided when the Senate was in recess or not the Senate. If the Senate went away for 3 days, he could say they were in recess. If too many of them decided they had to go to the bathroom, it's a recess. And Obama was using this for him to say, in violation of the Constitution, that he determined what in fact are the rights of the legislative branch. Now, not only the question of recess appointments, but most significantly, the issue of declaring war. And Obama has stated, and has restated again this week in a letter he wrote to Congress, the White House sent to Congress, that the executive branch and Obama view themselves as already authorized to launch yet another war in Iraq, this time, of the sort they were stopped from doing in Syria, but they were not stopped from doing in Libya. And this thing, in fact, could lead to a thermonuclear confrontation globally. Now, there's a tremendous amount of opposition to this brewing, importantly among Democrats. Because, for example, Senator Tim Kaine, Democrat of Virginia, wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post this week, which he then repeated on the Morning Joe program, where he stated explicitly, Obama absolutely must go to Congress if he wishes to wage war, in Iraq or anywhere else for that matter. And when the questioner said to him, well, but you're going totally against what Nancy Pelosi and other bigwigs in the Democratic Party are saying, Kaine said, yes, I disagree with Pelosi, because what's important here is not partisan politics. What's important is the Constitution of the United States, which could not be clearer. And on this point, Senator Kaine is absolutely correct. Now, not only these kinds of visible statements, you also have very important developments coming from intelligence and military circles in the United States, which also played a key role in stopping Obama's intended launching of military activity against Syria last year. In this case, it has come to light over the course of this week, and it has been made public, that senior intelligence officials of the Obama administration did in fact inform Congress and, of course, the White House that in Iraq a major offensive was imminent coming from the ISIS group and allies among Sunnis and others, sponsored, they didn't say this, but I will, sponsored by the British Empire, but that such an attack was actually imminent and that actions had to be taken on this. Now, we have reports from reliable sources of our own that there actually was a DIA memo, Defense Intelligence Agency memo, of December 2013, which warned of exactly the same thing. And yet, John Kerry dared to go before the media in the United States this week and to announce that what's happening in Iraq, that's something that nobody expected would happen. This is about as credible as what came out after Benghazi. It was known, and they lied about it. And what's happening now in the question of Iraq was known, and they're lying about it again. And if this is not stopped, if the measures are not taken immediately, if the Constitution is not made the actual operant document of the United States once again, then we're going to have, at the very least, a kind of tragedy in Iraq, which is going to make Benghazi look small by comparison in terms of the numbers of lives lost. Now, and just to finish off the picture, kind of the icing on the cake of this, for what's happened over the course of this week, is that House Speaker John Boehner actually announced publicly that he was planning to take legal action to launch a lawsuit against Obama for, quote, declining to faithfully execute the laws of the country. Although he did quickly explain that, as far as he was concerned, this had absolutely nothing to do with impeachment. That's not what he was proposing. Now, where this is going to lead remains to be seen, but I think what it definitely does demonstrate is that the thermostat under John Boehner's butt is functioning, because clearly he perceived the heat which is being applied to it. Because the population is outraged, the population has had enough of this. They don't know exactly where it's coming from, but they know this is a bunch of baloney. So now we have our mobilization, led by Mr. LaRouche, the LaRouche PAC mobilization, with a leaflet which I was just showing you, and you can get copies of and should and reproduce from the website. A mobilization which is designed to see if we can make the temperature rise so high that the thermostat breaks, not only under Boehner's butt, but under the butts of every single member of the House and the Senate.
Okay, thanks, Dennis. I'd like to continue with this theme of impeachment, because I think it's pertinent and important, and I know Mr. LaRouche is very heavy on making this happen. Now, given what Tim Kaine said, that Obama does need to come to the Congress before he engages in any kind of military action in Iraq or anywhere else, this echoes very much the sentiment that was swirling around the Obama administration in August of 2011. And Mr. LaRouche at that point in 2011 was very sternly then, again, calling for the impeachment and removal of Obama based off of his violation of his war powers in launching an attack on Libya, and then for the extrajudicial murder of Gaddafi. And for that, LaRouche said he should be impeached, he should be removed. And you had other voices like our friend Walter Jones also raising the same concerns. But if you look at what happened, so Obama on his own went into Libya, ordered these military actions, ordered the murder of Gaddafi, and opened up Libya to a complete overrunning and takeover by terrorists. In particular, LIFG, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, which is a Al-Qaeda-linked group, which effectively took over the country with backing from the Obama administration, while supposedly people like Brennan were in Libya to try to stop, quote-unquote, stop Al-Qaeda terrorism. But the country was overrun, Al-Qaeda-linked networks took over, and this effectively set up then what we saw in September 11th of 2012, which was the overrunning of the U.S. Embassy, which included the murder of Ambassador Stevens, which then Obama subsequently tried to cover up, to say this was not an act of terrorism. And it was, I think at this point, be worthwhile to bring in some of these quotes from the Edward Klein book, Blood Feud, of what Hillary Clinton actually said or thought about that period, whenever you had the attacks on the U.S. Embassy in Benghazi, Libya, and what Obama's complicity was in covering it up. So this is a quote from Edward Klein's book. And he says, this is reference to a call that Hillary received on September 11th. So by 10 p.m., this is a quote, by 10 p.m. on September 11th, 2012, when Hillary Clinton received a call from President Obama, she was one of the most thoroughly briefed officials in Washington on the unfolding disaster in Benghazi, Libya. She knew that Ambassador Christopher Stevens and a communications operator were dead, and that the attacks had launched a well-coordinated mortar assault on the CIA annex, which would cost the lives of 2 more Americans. She had no doubt that a terrorist attack had been launched against America on the anniversary of 9/11. However, when Hillary picked up the phone and heard Obama's voice, she learned the president had other ideas in mind. With less than 2 months before Election Day, he was still boasting that he had Al-Qaeda on the run. If the truth about Benghazi became known, it would blow that argument out of the water. Hillary was stunned when she heard the president talk about the Benghazi attack. One of her top legal advisors said in an interview, Obama wanted her to say that the attack had been a spontaneous demonstration triggered by an obscure video on the internet that demeaned the Prophet Muhammad. The advisor continued, Hillary told Obama, Mr. President, that story isn't credible. Among other things, it ignores the fact that the attack occurred on 9/11. But the president was adamant. He said, Hillary, I need you to put out a State Department release as soon as possible. After her conversation with the president, Hillary called Bill Clinton, who was at his penthouse apartment in the William J. Clinton Presidential Library in Little Rock, and told him what Obama wanted her to do. I'm sick about it, she said, according to the legal advisor, who was filled in on the conversation. The story won't hold, Bill said. I know, Hillary said. I told the president that. It's an impossible story, Bill said. I can't believe the president is claiming it wasn't terrorism. Then again, maybe I can. It looks like Obama isn't going to allow anyone to say that terrorism has occurred on his watch. End quote. Hillary's legal advisor provided further details. During the phone call, Bill started playing with the various doomsday scenarios up to and including the idea that Hillary considered resignation as Secretary of State over the issue. But both he and Hillary quickly agreed that resigning wasn't a realistic option. If her resignation hurt Obama's chances of winning re-election, her fellow Democrats would never forgive her. Hillary was already thinking of running for president in 2016, and her political future, as well as Obama's, hung in the balance. Obama had put Hillary in a corner, and she and Bill didn't see a way out. And it goes on from there. Now, we also, as stated in the leaflet previously referenced by Dennis, this LaRouche, Hillary Clinton's Benghazi revelations mean Obama must be impeached immediately, we do make the point that LaRouche-PAC, quote, LaRouche-PAC has confirmed from two highly qualified sources, including one with first-hand knowledge of the events of September 11th, 2012, that the client account of the telephone call between the President and Secretary Clinton is accurate. So we have cross-confirmed that this is, in fact, the truth. And obviously makes the point very clear that Obama is complicit in a cover-up on what happened with 9/11. Now, just to move things further, what's some of the backstory of what you had going on in Benghazi? As has become more and more clear as other revelations have come out, that in fact Benghazi was being used as an area to run guns where you had caches of weapons stored. We're running those guns into Syria, where again Obama was backing, on behalf of the British, was backing terrorists, actual terrorists, in an attempt to overthrow the elected government of Syria. And this included the backing of certain groups like the al-Nusra Front, who it came out were explicitly connected to Al-Qaeda. And the al-Nusra group is again a group which is connected to ISIS, the Islamic states in Syria and Iraq and Syria, and ISIL, which is similar thing. Now, Obama, in reference to Syria, people may remember in September of 2013, Obama had said Syria, the government of Syria, has crossed the line in the sand. Whenever revelations came out that the Syrian government had used chemical weapons against its people. Now, Obama, at that point, said the line in the sand had been crossed. He was prepared to go to war into Syria. But because of the interventions of Mr. LaRouche, of our organization, and other elements of the institution of the presidency, stepped in very forcefully and basically made it very clear to Obama, this will be the end of you if you follow through with this attack without congressional authority. Obama was forced to say he would go to Congress to seek congressional authority to carry out operations in Syria. That vote was then put on hold, and they found a diplomatic solution, and it then further came out that the revelations of the use of chemical weapons were in fact completely fraudulent, that in fact it was likely that the chemical weapons were used by the quote-unquote rebels or the terrorists, not the government. Now we're seeing, as a result of the attack on Libya, the spillover, the guns being brought into Syria, that is now spilling over directly now into Iraq, where, again, you've got fighters, this ISIS and ISIL, which are connected to groups which we were backing in Syria, are now the ones carrying out these military actions in Iraq to overthrow and destroy the government in Iraq, creating further chaos, increasing the growth of terrorism and Al-Qaeda in Iraq. To which now Obama is responding, maybe we need to go into Iraq. I'm ready to carry out military interventions in Iraq, and has explicitly said, I don't need to come to Congress for authorization to carry out military action in Iraq. I might do it, but I don't need it. And so you've got this very bizarre string of events which Obama is at the center of, which clearly show the necessity for Obama's impeachment. And I think for the common viewer out there who may get their sense of politics from, how you score a fight card in a boxing match. Who's the good guy, who's the bad guy, who's my home team. or their sense of politics is shaped by classical westerns. Who's wearing the white hat? Who's wearing the black hat? This all seems like a very bizarre, schizophrenic scene from Alice in Wonderland or something. So what really is behind this, this cluster expletive that we've got going on here in the Middle East? Is it just schizophrenia on the part of Obama? Or, as I'm sure you can elaborate, is there something more sinister and more coordinated, which is orchestrating these shadows that we're seeing on stage?
I strongly suspect that none of our viewers are common. I suspect they're all quite uncommon, at least I hope so, because what we have to do is not part of what common folk tend to think needs to happen. And in fact, there is no way of understanding what's going on here with a sports scorecard. It won't work. Barack Obama will never figure it out doing his brackets. And if you're watching too much of the World Cup, I strongly recommend that you stop immediately, because the world is going to hell in a handbasket now. What's actually behind this arc which you were describing from Libya to Syria to Iraq, is actually a single unified intent of the British Empire to trigger thermonuclear confrontation between the United States and NATO on the one side and Russia and China on the other. Mr. LaRouche said this from the moment that the news of Gaddafi's assassination went public. He reiterated that that was actually what was behind the attacks on Syria and the government there, and the attempt for violent regime change. And he has reiterated that that's the situation around Iraq again today. It is also what is ultimately behind the British policy to try to unleash warfare, irregular warfare, color revolutions right on the borders of Russia, as in the situation with Ukraine. There is a single, unified, very sinister indeed, British intent here, which is to unleash warfare. And you have a situation where, as you were saying, Rand Paul said this publicly over the course of this week, that ISIS in Iraq is now using the weapons that the U.S. helped transfer to the Syrian rebels. So what's actually going on here is a very long-standing British strategy of deliberately unleashing religious warfare, sectarian warfare, as a purpose of population reduction, chaos creation, and political control. Their actual objective, and in this policy Obama is acting as a direct agent of the Queen, their actual objective is to turn back the clock of history to before the signing of the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia. Now that treaty set in place an arrangement where the wars, the religious wars, which had swept Europe at the time, again at the instigation of the British Empire, at that time between Protestants and Catholics, that was ended with the Treaty of Westphalia, which premised the further development of all civilization on concepts totally hostile to the British Empire. The existence of sovereign nation states, and on the concept that what nations should do, as should individuals, is to foster the good of the other. That an order had to be put in place where the problems of the past, as defined in terms of religious warfare, were not to be settled moving forward. They could not be settled that way. And that instead an entirely new framework, a new world, had to be created on the basis of this concept of man, this concept of society, and the concept of the economy as one which is actually growing. So the idea was not beggar thy neighbor, the idea was prosper thy neighbor, as has been said. Now that is exactly what is going on today. The British are deliberately instigating circumstances where they are doing everything they possibly can to unleash barbarism, and they're doing a very good job of it. Because what they're doing is they are turning men into beasts. And you can see this in what has happened in Ukraine. You can see this in what is by the fascists, the neo-Nazis, the right wing, and so on there, the right sector. You can see in what's going on in Iraq. But it is the British hand behind this directly. And the British, in terms of their policy, do not care if the beasts they are creating are Catholic beasts or Protestant beasts, if they're Sunni beasts or Shiite beasts, if they're Jewish beasts or Hindu beasts, so long as the concept of man is reduced to bestiality, that is to say, that for my survival I have to destroy others, and I define myself in the most narrow sectarian bestial terms as opposed to human terms, that is Britain's field day, and that is what they are trying to do. Now, this is exactly the concept that Mr. LaRouche has often described as the Zeus principle in history, or, in language which some people understand more clearly, this is Satan. This is Satan turning viable, potentially creative human beings into acting like beasts, just as happened in the Roman Empire in the Roman arena, where the lions and the Christians fought it out, and each gladiator was turned into more of a beast than the other gladiator he was trying to destroy. And it is this kind of Satanism of the British Empire which is actually what is going on and is their guiding hand in this otherwise confusing situation. And I would like to quote the comments issued in an article that was just published in the latest edition of Executive Intelligence Review magazine of the LaRouche movement, which was written by Sergei Glassiev, who is an advisor to the president of the Russian Federation, an advisor to Putin. Glassiev, who, as our viewers will recall, also sent a very important message of greeting to the recent Schiller Institute conference held in New York City. And in this article, what Glassiev said is the following. He said, if we analyze who is influencing U.S. policy, and he's talking about Ukraine, but much more than Ukraine. He's talking about the whole situation. If we analyze who is influencing U.S. policy, it is not difficult to see that the ones responsible for those decisions are a handful of deranged radical extremists. The so-called neocons, he points to, who see the entire world through the lens of their war to assert world rule. This is a small group of the American oligarchy, and it is also fascism, as it is in its own way, based not on radical nationalism, but on global hegemonism. These neocons are real misanthropes and Satanists who are even prepared to drop the atomic bomb. Now, Glassiev's analysis falls short in a couple of ways in pointing only to one aspect. The neocons are certainly deserving of everything that he says, but it is a broader picture than that. It is the British Empire. There's the neocons and there's the neo-libs. There's both sides of the equation that the British always play in this thing. And therefore, I think that it's important to point to this and this issue, the underlying issue of the Treaty of Westphalia, as precisely the concept that the British are trying to destroy. But most importantly, to destroy it not simply in terms of the nation states and the economy, but to destroy it in the minds of men, which is the actual central, most important battlefield.
Well, a very significant showdown in this battlefield against the British Empire is now taking place in Argentina. People may have been following this story more or less closely, but in the wake of the Supreme Court decision to uphold federal judge Thomas Grease's ruling in favor of the so-called vulture funds, a total war has broken out, with Argentina making it very clear that they intend to fight for their sovereignty and that they will not just lay down and die. And an overwhelming number of other countries have taken Argentina's side in this battle, which we'll elaborate more on later. But just to give a little bit of background, in 2005, Argentina uniquely broke ranks with the IMF murderous debt collection regime, and conducted a top-down, sovereign restructuring of all of its foreign debt, renegotiating with the vast majority of its creditors, 92.4% to be exact, in order to secure longer terms and lower rates on their outstanding debts. And in the meantime, Argentina has adopted a very aggressive domestic investment growth strategy, to reverse the terrible conditions that it had faced at the time of its default in 2001, when unemployment officially reached 25% and over 50% of the population was in poverty, abject poverty. The rejection of the IMF conditionalities and the adoption of a sovereign policy by Argentina of investment in science and advanced technology, including especially nuclear energy and the space program, allowed Argentina to create enough real wealth through advances in productivity to allow it to pay off its restructured debts without killing its people, which is exactly the opposite of what we see now happening in Greece, in Portugal, in Ireland, in Spain, for example, who have continued to submit to the IMF regime. The Argentine government issued a full-page open letter, which was published in over a dozen major newspapers in Europe and the United States this week, and they said in that, the fundamental principle, this is slide 1, the fundamental principle of all negotiations conducted with creditors was always the same. In order to be able to pay, Argentina must first grow, so as to generate the resources that will enable it to honor its commitments. Growth to enable payments has been the hallmark of all debt negotiations conducted by Argentina since 2003. Under this approach, for over a decade, Argentina's economy has been growing, bringing down unemployment and continuing to reduce its debt. So, as I said, approximately 93% of Argentina's foreign creditors accepted this restructuring and consequently have been receiving payments punctually and on a regular basis. However, 7% of the bondholders did not accept the restructuring and continued to hold out for the full face value of the debts that they claimed against Argentina. And although Argentinian domestic law protects the government from these so-called holdouts and allows it to continue to pay the creditors that did accept the restructuring, these vulture funds, as they've come to be known, decided to sue Argentina in U.S. court and secured a ruling in their favor which asserts that Argentina must pay them in full, or else the country's assets can be seized to the tune of $15 billion, which is over 50% of Argentina's foreign currency reserves. So this is a clear violation of Argentinian national sovereignty, obviously. Plus, it threatens to drive Argentina back into default, since the assets that these vulture funds wish to seize would leave Argentina completely incapable of delivering on its upcoming installment of debt payments to its creditors with whom they had renegotiated in good faith, who in turn would then come back at the same time demanding that they get equal treatment and be paid in full, just like the vulture funds as well. And then, of course, beyond Argentina, this sets a murderous precedent worldwide, precluding the possibility of any other country ever restructuring its debts like Argentina did, and saying that these Wall Street pirates, these vulture funds, have the right to seize the assets of any nation in the world, regardless of all considerations of national sovereignty and sovereign constitutional law. Now, the two vulture funds who brought this case, NML Capital, which is owned by Paul Singer, whom I know Dennis has something to say about later, and Aurelius Capital Management, really are precisely that, vultures, or scavengers, which feed off the dead carcasses of rotting meat, buying up so-called zombie debts at pennies on the dollar, and then coming in with extortion and threats to try to collect on this dead debt in order to then gain astronomical returns. And the Argentinian government makes this very clear in their open letter, their advertisement that was published this week. They say, the vulture funds that secured a ruling in their favor are not even original lenders to Argentina. They purchased bonds at obscenely low prices for the sole purpose of engaging in litigation against Argentina and making an enormous profit. Paul Singer's NML fund, for example, in 2008, paid only $48.7 million US for bonds in default. Judge Grease's ruling now orders that it be paid an amount of $832 million US. That is a gain of 1,608% in only 6 years. So this is clearly a policy of all-out financial warfare on the nation of Argentina, but as I said, Argentina has refused to submit. The economics minister of Argentina, Axel Kicillof, said, if a ruling asks us to commit suicide, we're not going to commit suicide. Now, let me just cite one more thing from Cristina, the president of Argentina, who delivered a nationally televised speech in response to this on June 16th. Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner said, there is no reason why Argentina should be submitted to such an extortion. This isn't an economic or financial problem, or even a legal one. This is a form of global domination of financial derivatives to bring nations to their knees. And then the last slide. In a speech that President Cristina Fernandez delivered at the G77 summit in Bolivia, she said the following. In this kind of anarcho-capitalism, where a small group of financiers runs the rest of humanity, a group known as vulture funds obtained debt instruments at absurdly low prices. Financiers who don't even pay taxes because their official headquarters are in tax havens and which only represent 1 or 2% of Argentina's total debt. And yet this small group of vulture funds is endangering not only Argentina, but in reality what is at stake is the international financial system and the international economic system, more than the financial system. This is financial capitalism and the appearance of what is called financial derivatives, which began to generate, or at least made the world believe that they were generating money, without going through the cycle of the production of goods and services, which is impossible and obviously generates astronomically high prices, but also the existence of fictitious money. Now, I think Christina's remarks here hit precisely at a number of very key issues that Lyndon LaRouche has emphasized continuously, including this morning. The fraud of the entire Wall Street system of derivatives and fictitious monetary speculation. The fact that money itself has no intrinsic value in isolation from real physical productivity, and the intent of the international financial oligarchy to destroy the sovereignty of nations. And Mr. LaRouche stated this past Monday on our discussion with the Policy Committee that the assault now underway against Argentina is identical to the policy of bailout and bail-in that the bankrupt City of London and the bankrupt Wall Street are now forcing upon nations all around the world. So my question, Dennis, is what is the underlying intention behind this policy and how do we defeat it?
Well, this is the bail-in policy. This is exactly what the British intended policy is. They intend to not simply try to collect the debt, because they're actually not interested in a viable restructured debt arrangement. They're planning to, according to various accounts, try to seize Argentina's oil, seize Argentine national territory, and simply take over and destroy any actual physical productive capabilities in order to maintain this predatory, very small portion of the global financial system. After the Cyprus template, which you heard about from us on LaRouche PAC in terms of this bail-in policy where people's accounts were stolen, where people were bailed in, i.e. unsecured creditors like bank depositors had everything stolen from them, they're now trying to proceed with what you might call the Argentine template as an example for the rest of the world, except this one is backfiring because Argentina is resisting. And in the statements that Matt was reading, what President Fernandez de Kirchner actually does is she says the responsibility for the Supreme Court decision of the United States in which they backed these vulture funds lies at the doorstep of the government of the United States. In effect, Argentina joined the pile-on against Obama. They didn't mention Obama. They were very careful diplomatically, but they said the United States is now responsible for the destruction of the global financial system, which is about to happen as a result of this thing. Now, what's going on here is the idea of enforcing paper property rights over human existence. That's what's at issue here. And Mr. LaRouche, when we discussed this with him today, was quite emphatic. There is no such property right which has any validity over the rights of human beings to exist. And just take a look at a couple of historical precedents. If you've heard arguments about how we have to respect people's property rights no matter what, well, I seem to recall a discussion about that topic during the Civil War in the United States, when slaves were considered property. I mean, the slave owners had actual title, probably better legal arguments than NML Capital. Did they have rights? Or let's take it back a little bit further, and this might perhaps annoy some people in the political circles in the United States. What was the real Tea Party all about, actually? I mean, who owned the tea? Did we respect that? Did the British have a right, the property over that tea, over and above our right to create a sovereign nation? Of course not. Now, on this question of what can be done, to be able to discuss this, because the Supreme Court decision has really upped the ante in this situation. We've had numerous discussions with people in Congress over the course of the last couple of days where they've asked us, well, what can we do? We're the legislative branch. That's the Supreme Court. What could we do? Well, I would suggest that what the legislative branch should do is what the Constitution says they should do, which is pass laws. And the simplest and quickest way to make sure that the Supreme Court crazy genocidal decision on Argentina is overturned is to pass a law called Glass-Steagall. And if that were passed, the entirety of everything that MLL Capital and all of these hedge funds are doing would be instantly illegal, and we'd be back where we should be on square one on this thing. So there's plenty that the Congress can do. Now, the issue here is the blowout of the system. And I want to take a step back because this is not an Argentine problem. What has been going on, as we can see in the first slide that I've prepared to be shown tonight, and which people who are watching this show have probably seen before. This is the totality of world financial aggregates. This is all of the financial instruments that are out there, which has been growing astronomically, and the red part of it are the derivatives. That is to say, completely meaningless speculative activity, bets against losses which are backed by nothing. That's your correct definition of a derivative, by the way. And there's a small portion of this whole global bubble, which is debt of countries and of companies and of individuals, and that's the green part. And then the blue part is all the stock markets in the world. So all of that stuff is really nothing. 90% of this is derivatives. And what you can see is that this was, especially after 1999, which is the first vertical line, which is when Glass-Steagall was repealed, derivatives took off like a rocket. The next vertical line happens in 2007, 2008, which is when the system blew up. And all of a sudden, it wasn't so easy to keep going with this hyperinflationary process. What should have happened is that the whole derivatives bubble should have been completely written off. But instead, what happened is that arrangements were made through quantitative easing and a hyperinflationary process to somehow contain and hold on to the existence of that total cancerous bubble. That continued up until 2012, December 2012. What happened then, next, can be seen here. From December 2012 until today, the rate of growths of derivatives has gone from 8.5% in the first 6-month period on a yearly basis to 12.4% to over 19% per year growth rate of derivatives today. This is a blowout. This is a hyperinflationary blowout. And if you want to know why the British Empire is so desperate to launch a war, a thermonuclear war, if you want to know why they're so desperate to wipe out nations such as Argentina, all you need to know is that this system of theirs is gone. Now, how does this relate to the bail-in policy? Well, it's really not that complicated, because the point to be made is that one man's bailout is another man's bail-in. In other words, the whole idea of the bail-in policy, in other words, whose assets are seized, the question is who's excluded from that. And in the entire bail-in policy, in Dodd-Frank, in the European Commission documents, in the Bank of England, derivatives are excluded. They don't get touched. They have a go-home free pass. And everybody else gets bailed in to bail out that 90% of the global cancerous bubble. And that's what's going on, which is why the British policy, in fact, leads to intentionally wiping out 6 out of 7 billion human beings. Now, when this was discussed with Mr. LaRouche today, and he had a chance to glance at this graph, which you've just seen, he said very simply, just cancel it. It's speculative. The claims are fraudulent. Our Constitution provides no security for speculation. This all comes from the British Empire's policy. The Queen is the source of the evil. She has nothing coming to her other than pain. Now then, Mr. LaRouche went on to say, Wall Street is perpetrating genocide. Their speculation is unlawful. They should be wiped out. We don't need them. Alternately, they could be hung by their testicles with a piano wire. And he then specified, it's Wall Street or mankind, your choice.
Now, Mr. LaRouche also stressed this morning when we spoke with him that if you look at the global alliance of nations that are now lining up in solidarity with Argentina, which includes Russia, China, India, Brazil, as well as the entire G77 group of nations, that this is enough to break this entire thing open against the British Empire. He said if you look at all the nations that are now coming together to resist the British Empire on this issue, and ask yourself what portion of the world's total population that coalition of forces represents, then it is clear to see what the real implications of this battle really are. So let me show you a map of these countries. This map shows the G77 in green, which actually consists of now 133 member nations, comprising, as you can see, almost the entirety of the southern hemisphere. This group largely overlaps in terms of membership with the so-called non-aligned movement countries. And then in blue, you can see Russia, which alone comprises 11.5% of the total land area of the planet. The G77 countries represent a total of 5.6 billion people, or 78% of the entire world population. And if you add in Russia, it's 80% of the entire population of the world. So these are the nations that have declared solidarity with Argentina in its war against Wall Street and the City of London. This Wednesday, June 25th, at the conclusion of a meeting of the G77 in New York City, the 133 member nations voted unanimously to give the G77's, quote, unanimous support to Argentina in its battle against the vulture funds. The current president of the G77, the Bolivian UN ambassador, Sacha Laurenti Solis, proclaimed, Argentina's cause is the cause of the G77. And then after a speech that was delivered by the Argentine economics minister in which he described how foreign banks have used usurious debts to loot and extort and bankrupt Argentina for over 150 years, going back to the £1 million loan from the British Empire's Baring Bank in 1824, he received a standing ovation from the entire G77, with one ambassador after another coming forward to voice their wholehearted support for the cause of Argentina. The ambassador from India declared that the Vulture Fund ruling is, quote, disastrous not only for Argentina, but for the entire developing world and the international financial system. The Brazilian ambassador denounced the ruling as irresponsible, speculative, morally questionable, with both social and economic impact on Argentina, as well as a destructive and systemic impact on the international financial architecture. And the ambassador from Cuba declared that the actions of the Vulture Funds, quote, are an act of genocide. All sense of ethics, all moral capacity has been lost. So, at the same time, the G77 is voicing their solidarity. The Russians have expressed their own solidarity with Argentina. We just got word that Vladimir Putin has announced that he will be traveling to Argentina to meet with Kristina Kirchner in July. After the BRICS meeting, he said they will discuss nuclear energy, heavy machine industry, and technical military cooperation, and that Argentina is a key ally in Latin America for Russia. And this week, a delegation from the Argentine Congress traveled to Moscow to meet with Sergei Lavrov, who voiced Russia's firm support for Argentina, in this case, as well as reiterating Russia's support for Argentina's sovereignty in the Malvinas question against the British. And then the ambassador, or the leader of the Argentine delegation, the president of Argentina's Chamber of Deputies, voiced similar solidarity in support of Russia, including in the case of Ukraine and Crimea. And the head of the delegation, Dominguez, said the vast support that Argentina is seeing from around the world, that you could see from that map, shows that what is at stake is the power of sovereign states against the power of finance capital. And it is absolutely a war to defend the principle of national sovereignty. I think the quote from the president of Uruguay, Jose Mujica, says it best. He says, "We have to come up with something to lend Argentina a hand, allowing it to launch a counter-coup, so that the confrontation becomes a global one, not just one involving Argentina. Today they come for you, but tomorrow they'll come for me." And let me just conclude with a statement that was issued during the press conference after the G77 meeting in New York, in which Kristina Kirchner was quoted saying, "Today, the vulture funds endanger the international financial system. This is not a matter of North or South, but of a productive economy against a speculative one." And I think that is highly appropriate, because this is the same point that Mr. LaRouche has been making repeatedly about the transatlantic system versus the trans-Pacific Eurasian system. The former, the transatlantic Wall Street London system, is dying under the weight of anti-science, anti-human green policies, and as you saw from the chart that Dennis presented just now, hyperinflationary speculation, while the latter, the Eurasian system, is growing due to a high technology, high productivity science driver orientation. And Mr. LaRouche has stressed that these two systems represent, as Dennis stated, two opposing views of man. A Zeusian or satanic view of man versus a Promethean view of man. So, Dennis, can you address the question of what is defining this emerging resistance among this new configuration of nations in the world?
Yeah.
Maybe we can just include.
Yeah. And solidarity is very good, but it's not enough. It's not going to work if it's limited to solidarity. It's going to take kicking over the chessboard altogether and replacing the current policy with an alternate policy. And that's where the LaRouche question comes into play as the central issue on a strategic basis. Now, the connection between Argentina and Putin and the BRICS countries in general is quite interesting, because Russia today is no stranger to economic warfare. And there is a wide-ranging discussion underway inside Russia at this point over what policies have to be adopted to not just defend Russia, but to actually replace the system with a new one. That is the kind of discussion which Argentina is also initiating by their discussion here and what has happened here, so that the meeting between Argentina and the other BRICS countries in Fortaleza, Brazil on July 15th could be quite interesting, as can the subsequent visit of not only President Putin, but also President Xi Jinping of China as well, who will be visiting Argentina too. So there's going to be plenty of discussion, which is not what you're going to read in the newspaper headlines, which is going to be the serious question of, okay, what replaces this? Now, the point is very straightforward. Again, when we talked to Mr. LaRouche this morning about these issues, he said, look, excuse me, what's going on right now is that South America, by and large, is holding up with Argentina. The Pope is also backing Argentina. Russia is going to resist, that they've made clear. China will do also the same thing. So Wall Street, Mr. LaRouche says, has a big problem. What are they going to do? They're going to take this to a showdown, as Judge Grisa and the Supreme Court and the Obama administration and the British seem intent on doing? Good, LaRouche said. What are they going to do? Declare war on all of South America, Russia, and China? Now, the key strategy guiding what is the answer to this British imperial offensive is LaRouche's four-point program, or the 4 laws which he has proposed as required not only inside the United States, but internationally as well. And let me just identify these very briefly. You can and you must read them in detail in LaRouche's writings. First of all, we have to have Glass-Steagall reinstated. And here, again, as with all of LaRouche's measures, it is simply American constitutional law and principle being applied. That's exactly what Glass-Steagall was, and it was implemented, as people know, under the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So there's a precedent for this. Point number 2, establish a national bank of exactly the sort which was established by Lincoln with a greenback policy. Number 3, use that national bank to actually create a functional credit system which issues credit uniquely and exclusively for the purpose of economic projects which develop the productive powers of labor. This is exactly as specified by Alexander Hamilton. And the 4th point that LaRouche identified is we must have a fusion, thermonuclear fusion power-based economic science driver to move forward to the frontier areas of science and technology that are required. Now, although President Kennedy did not specifically lay out the concept LaRouche has said here, it's very much the same thing in terms of what his concept of NASA was and what this policy needed to be. So in LaRouche's 4-point program, as a unique solution to the current global crisis, he's in fact resonating with the constitutional principle guiding the United States as represented by 4 leading figures of our country over the course of its history: Roosevelt, FDR, Lincoln, Hamilton, and Kennedy. Now, what's the underlying issue involved here? I mentioned the Treaty of Westphalia because I think this gives us a good point of access to what the actual underlying issue is. Many people have said that you know a society by how it treats its prisoners, its elderly, its most vulnerable people. Today I think we can say, and this is a point which both Lyndon Larouche and his wife Helga Zepp LaRouche have repeatedly emphasized, that we can know the moral character of the human species by how we treat Africa. Now, let me tell you about Paul Singer, the head of NML Capital, because he got his stripes to pick on Argentina by picking on African countries. For example, the case of the Democratic Republic of Congo, where he bought debt for $3 million. This was absolutely non-performing dead debt, zombie debt as it's called, distressed debt, carrion, financial carrion. And he then turned around and sued in the courts to, by extortion, force the government of the Democratic Republic of Congo to pay $100 million on $3 million investment. And this was adjudicated in that great center of international law, the Jersey Islands. And I don't mean New Jersey. I mean the British Jersey Islands. Other African countries, the same thing. What Singer and other of the... By the way, Singer is a big fundraiser, a major fundraiser for congressional Republicans. So that needs to be kept in mind. Some of these other funds, for example, have sued African countries and demanded that the funds that they were getting to help them with the AIDS problem should not be used for AIDS, but should be paid to the vulture funds. Property, after all, right? I mean, even the slave owners in the South of the United States in the Civil War couldn't have come up with an argument that that is that criminal and bestial, or maybe they could, but it's the same thing. Again on Africa, just to refer now to the green policy of the British Empire, there was a meeting of a group called GLOBE, Global Legislators Organization for a Balanced Environment. It probably should be called Global Legislators at the Order of the British Empire. This is a group founded by Tony Blair and Al Gore. It is headed by the Right Honourable John Gummer, otherwise known as Lord Debon. It is headquartered in London. They met in Mexico. They argued that not only is it necessary to denuclearize, which will kill millions of people, if not billions, not only decarbonize, that knocks out another couple of billion people, but they lectured the African delegates present that they had to cut back on the use of wood in their economies because it was damaging the environment, which led the representative, ironically, of the Democratic Republic of Congo to say that we need the forest to feed our people, to get heat, to cook. You cannot tell your wife to stop using firewood and not provide an alternative source of energy. So this is the economics, this is the so-called science, this is the morality of the British Empire. Now, where does it come from? Well, let's talk about somebody called Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes wrote a very famous book called Leviathan. He wrote the book in 1651. That's 3 years after the signing of the Treaty of Westphalia. Thomas Hobbes and the British Empire were bad losers. And they wanted to reverse this then, and they want to reverse it now. So Thomas Hobbes presented a concept of man, which has been the Roman idea, the Aristotelian idea, the British imperial idea, going way, way back. It's the idea that man is nothing but an animal governed by sense perception. For example, in the first quote, which you'll see on your screen right now, Hobbes said, "There is no conception in a man's mind which has not at first, totally or by parts, been begotten upon the organs of sense." Now, what did this lead him to in terms of his concept of how society is to be organized and his concept of man? Well, as you can see in the next quote, he says, "During the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe," and let me say parenthetically, that is Hobbes's idea of Leviathan. There is total chaos going on, so you need Leviathan. You need a dictator. Otherwise, you won't know what to do. So he says, during the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, they are in that condition which is called war, and such a war as is of every man against every man. To this war of every man against every man, this is also consequent, that nothing can be unjust. The notions of right and wrong, justice and injustice, have there no place. And what does this mean in terms of the individual? Oh, he says, quote, "Private appetite is the measure of good and evil. Felicity is a continual progress of the desire from one object to another." Now, there's somebody else who I seem to recall having said something similar, who was a close ally of Thomas Hobbes's. It's the guy who said, "Every man has his price," and that's Satan, who, by the way, I've heard more recently has in fact registered as a lobbyist before the Congress of the United States. Now, there is a contrary view, of course, and this is the view that is behind LaRouche's four-point program. And it is the view that created the American Revolution. It's the Renaissance view that was battling it out with the British Empire even then, because in the same period after the Treaty of Westphalia, when the British, the bad losers, launched their attack on it, as you can see in Hobbes's concept, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz in 1702, wrote about similar issues as to what the nature of man is actually all about. And Leibniz has a crucial role to play in the founding of the United States. In fact, he's one of our founding fathers. Leibniz said, and this is the next quote I'd like to show, "Justice is goodness conformed to wisdom. And wisdom, in my sense, is nothing else than the science of felicity." Not Hobbes's view of felicity as flitting from one object of desire to another, which you ravage and you deal with the way NML Capital deals with these things. It's the science of felicity, of the pursuit of happiness, if you've ever heard that expression, which is based on justice being goodness conformed to wisdom. That man is basically good by nature. The next slide talks about how this plays out. Leibniz says, "Thus, the sovereign wisdom of the Creator has so well regulated all things that our duty must also be our happiness, that all virtue produces its own reward, and that all crime punishes itself sooner or later." Now, these views of Leibniz are the founding concepts of the United States of America. They are embodied in our Constitution. They were embodied in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. They are embodied in the Hamiltonian concept of economics. And they're embodied in our country's lifelong war to the death against the British Empire. And one of the earliest spokesmen for this Leibnizian view that man is by nature good, he can be turned evil. Satan is always around there as a lobbyist trying to buy people. But he is by nature good because he is endowed with creative reason. And that reason allows him to make choices from free will which can be moral or immoral. But man can be moral because he has creativity. Now, one of the most purest expressions of this comes from Cotton Mather, who wrote in his Essays to Do Good in 1710, just right after Leibniz, under heavy Leibnizian influence. He says, "It is an invaluable honor to do good. It is an incomparable pleasure. A man must look upon himself as dignified and gratified by God when an opportunity to do good is put into his hands. He must embrace it with rapture, as enabling him to answer the great end of his being." And that is the guiding concept, in fact, in the founding of the United States, in followers of Cotton Mather, such as Benjamin Franklin and the founding fathers and the framers of the Constitution. But Mather was also very clear on another matter, which I think makes the point that I want to underscore on this webcast. Mather also said the following. If you would put this on the screen, please. He says, "Rulers who make no use of their higher station than to swagger over their neighbors, and command their obsequious flatteries, and enrich themselves with the spoils of which they are able to pillage them, and then wallow in sensual and brutal pleasures, these are the basest of men." Now, I didn't know that Cotton Mather knew Barack Obama. But it sounds like he certainly did. And there is no question in my mind that he would be the first one in line to get that leaflet printed off our website, and he'd be out on the street corners leafleting with it today. Thank you.
Well, with that said, we're going to bring a conclusion to our webcast tonight. So I thank you all for joining us, and I especially thank Dennis for joining us here in the studio tonight, as well as Cody Jones. Please stay tuned to LaRouchepack.com. Good night.